Forget everything you think you know about Viking weddings. Forget the flower crowns, the laughter, the roaring fires surrounded by dancing families. The truth was far older, far darker. A ritual not of love, but of allegiance, blood, and gods who demanded more than devotion. These were not the Vikings of romantic legend or silver screen bravery. These were the ones history tried to bury beneath myth and memory. The ones who believed that love meant nothing without a sacrifice. They didn't just celebrate love, they sanctified it with blood. In our world, a wedding is a promise sealed with music and vows, a union of souls beneath the warmth of light. But in the Viking world, the light came from torches burning beside altars drenched in animal blood. The scent of mead mingled with iron and smoke, and the laughter that filled the longhouse was shadowed by fear. A bride's veil was not only a symbol of purity, it was a mask, hiding terror from the gods who watched. Where we toss flowers, they spilled entrails. Where we pray for blessings, they chanted over slaughter. The ceremony was not meant to unite two hearts, but to bind two clans, and sometimes two fates, beneath the cold gaze of Odin and Freya. These were alliances forged for power, not passion, for survival, not sentiment. Imagine it, a royal bride standing before the altar, the winter wind biting through her gown, the crowd chanting her name. At her feet lies the offering, a goat, a boar, sometimes more. Its blood seeps into the earth, a gift to the gods who guard the harvest, the war, and the womb. Her groom, a king or warrior, cuts his palm and lets the blood fall beside it, mingling man and beast in a single, sacred pool. Only then is the marriage complete. No priest speaks of love. No promise of forever is made. Instead, the gods are invoked, Odin for wisdom, Thor for strength, Freya for fertility. Each name carries both blessing and curse. For every vow whispered in their honor was believed to echo beyond life itself. And as the feast begins, the horns raised, the meat carved, the songs rising into the dark. One question lingers, silent as frost upon the land. When a Viking king said, "I do," who or what was really listening? In Viking society, a royal wedding was never just a union. It was a declaration of war disguised as romance. Behind the smiles carved into wood and the songs echoing across frozen fjords, every vow was a move on the chessboard of survival. Marriage was a weapon, sharper than the sword, quieter than the axe. And its roots reached deep into the soil of Norse paganism, where every bond between man and woman mirrored a greater bond between gods and fate. To the Vikings, marriage was cosmic, not personal. It wasn't about love. It was about aligning human flesh with divine will. Freya, goddess of fertility and desire, was invoked to bless the wombs of queens, not for their happiness, but for the heirs they would bear to carry bloodlines forward. Odin, the Allfather, symbolized wisdom and sacrifice, reminding kings that every union required an offering, often in blood, to maintain favor with the unseen powers. These gods were not gentle. Their myths were soaked in loss, betrayal, and death, and so were the marriages inspired by them. The rituals themselves reflected this violent divinity. Before the ceremony, altars were smeared with the blood of freshly slaughtered animals. Horses, goats, or boars. Entrails were read like sacred texts, their shapes believed to reveal the gods' approval or wrath. The couple stood barefoot upon the earth, feeling its cold pulse beneath them, while shamans whispered ancient prayers that blurred the line between blessing and curse. The bride's hand was placed in her groom's, not as a gesture of equality, but of surrender. Her body offered as a vessel for lineage, her will dissolved into the family she was traded to the royal families. These rituals were not superstition, they were strategy. Each drop of blood spilled on the altar was proof of divine sanction, a visible sign that their union was blessed by forces beyond human challenge. Power was sacred only if it was sanctified, and marriage was the most public, most symbolic way to do it. In this belief, love was irrelevant. Legitimacy was everything. The sagas spoke beautifully of destiny, weaving poetry from pain. Yet behind the rhythm of their verses lay the horror of their reality. For every myth of Freya's tears or Odin's sacrifice, there was a human echo, a bride weeping before dawn, a groom offering blood to gods that never answered. And as the centuries passed, the hunger for divine approval only deepened. When animal offerings failed to bring fortune, when omens turned black and crops withered despite the blood, kings began to whisper of darker sacrifices, those that required not beasts, but human breath. Because in the world of Viking power, devotion was measured not by love, but by the courage to kill for it. And when the blood wasn't enough, they turned on their own. For Viking women, even queens, marriage was not a promise. It was a price. The bride price, or munda, was no token of affection. It was currency, livestock, silver, land, or sometimes the blood of enemies, paid not to honor the woman, but to own her. A bride was the hinge between clans, the coin that sealed alliances, the vessel through which bloodlines were bargained. The poets would sing of beauty, of fair-haired maidens and golden halls, but behind the songs lay silence, the silence of young girls torn from their homes, dressed in furs and fear, and sent across hostile seas to men they had never seen. Some were as young as 14. Their worth measured not by their will, but by their wombs. The royal bride did not step into marriage. She was delivered into it, wrapped not in lace, but in obligation. Imagine the scene, the longhouse glowing with torchlight, walls lined with shields and skulls of hunted beasts, the air thick with the stench of mead, sweat and smoke. Warriors feast and shout, their laughter booming like thunder, while at the center sits the bride, silent, pale, her eyes fixed on the carved altar before her. Around her neck, a pendant of iron to ward off spirits. Around her wrists, gold, symbols not of love, but of possession. When the final toast is made, the feast turns. The crowd chants her husband's name, drunk on mead and anticipation. The bride is led away, or sometimes not led away at all. In certain halls, the consummation was not a private act, but a public spectacle, witnessed by chieftains and elders who demanded proof of fertility, proof that the union was real. The screams that followed were treated as ritual, the breaking of flesh seen as the blessing of gods. No priest comforted her. No mother's hand held hers. The morning after, the same men who watched would raise their horns again, declaring the bride fertile, the marriage divine, the alliance sealed. For the girl, the ceremony never ended. Her body became a battlefield, her womb the soil where dynasties grew, her silence the shield that kept her alive. The sagas call these women peace weavers, but peace was the one thing they were never granted. Some learned to wield quiet power through cunning and counsel. Others faded into the shadows of the longhouse, forgotten except as mothers of kings. Their faces are lost to time, but their suffering lingers. In the songs that omit their cries, in the halls that still echo with forced laughter. So when we imagine the radiant Viking bride, crowned in flowers and destiny, remember the girl beneath the veil, the trembling child traded between gods and men, promised to power but stripped of freedom. Because in the Viking world, love was a privilege, but power was a ritual of fear. In the Viking world, a royal wedding was meant to unite kingdoms, but more often, it fed them to the flames. Behind every golden cup and honeyed word lurked the quiet hum of danger. The longhouse glowed with torches, laughter thundered through its beams, and yet every man at the table kept a hand near his blade. Because in those feasts of alliance, trust was the first course and betrayal the last. The sagas tell us that no feast was ever just a feast. Every toast carried a secret meaning, every song concealed an insult, and every guest knew that a wedding banquet could turn to blood before the mead cooled. In the tale of King Sigurd and Queen Gudrun, celebration ended in slaughter. The bride's family ambushed by hidden warriors disguised as guests, their screams drowned by drums. In another saga, the Feast of Ravens, a rival clan was poisoned mid-toast, their bodies left to rot beneath the same tables where oaths of peace had been sworn hours before. To outsiders, these stories sound like myth, but to the Vikings, they were cautionary truths. Reminders that the same gods who blessed unions also reveled in chaos. Loki, the trickster, was said to haunt such gatherings, whispering deceit into mortal ears, turning toasts into traps and promises into curses. The more sacred the occasion, the more tempting it was for betrayal to strike. For nothing pleased the Norse gods more than irony carved in flesh. The rituals of joy were indistinguishable from rituals of death. Poisoned mead was poured from the same horn used for blessings. Dagger points glinted in candlelight beside wedding gifts. Even the songs of union carried verses that hinted at vengeance. Lines about wolves among sheep, or lovers destined to die by each other's side. To be a royal guest at a Viking wedding was to dance on a sword's edge, smiling while waiting to see who would fall first. The banquet was the stage, But the real performance played in the eyes. A father watching his son's killer feast beside him. A bride smiling through grief, knowing her new husband's clan had slain her kin. Revenge in these halls was never postponed. It was served alongside the meat, disguised as celebration, and when the last horn was emptied, and the fires dimmed to embers, the survivors carried home more than hangovers. They carried curses, suspicions, and the bitter truth that every alliance bought with blood would one day demand repayment in kind. Among Vikings, a wedding wasn't the end of conflict, it was its disguise. But what happened after the feast was even darker. When the feast ended and the laughter faded, the true ceremony began. Long after the guests had stumbled to sleep, when the torches burned low and the moon hung pale above the fjords, the newly joined families gathered in silence. The echoes of music were gone, replaced by whispers, by the slow chant of names too old to be spoken in daylight. This was the night of blood oaths, the ritual that turned marriage into something far more binding than love. They met in the open, beneath ancient trees whose roots were said to drink from the veins of the earth itself. The air was cold, heavy with mist and mead breath, and the gods were called to witness. Odin was invoked for wisdom, Freya for fertility, Thor for strength, but always death lingered close, for no union was holy without a sacrifice. The groom would unsheathe his knife, the same blade used in war, and cut his palm open. The bride, trembling, silent, was often commanded to do the same. Their blood would mingle in a shared bowl of wine or animal blood, then passed among their kin to drink. The mingling of life and death was deliberate. The Vikings believed that blood carried not just life, but memory, the will of ancestors, and the gaze of the gods. To mix it was to merge more than families, it was to fuse souls. Some kings, hungry for divine favor, went further. Chronicles whisper of those who mixed their blood not just with each other's, but with that of sacrificed animals, boars, horses, even ravens. Their reasoning was as simple as it was chilling. If blood was sacred, then more blood meant greater power. The symbolism was forbidden and beautiful. The act was meant to ensure fertility, to invite the gods into their lineage, to weave destiny and death into the same thread. But beneath the chants and ritual movements lay fear, a quiet primal terror that to fail the gods was to curse one's descendants. Every drop of blood was both offering and warning. Every oath sworn that night carried the weight of eternity. The moon watched it all, pale, indifferent, reflected in the bowl where red ripples shimmered like liquid flame. The witnesses stood still, their faces painted with ash, their hearts pounding as knives traced shallow cuts along their own skin. The chant grew louder, faster, until the air itself seemed to tremble. When it ended, there was no applause, no celebration, only silence, the kind that feels alive, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. In the minds of those who stood there, the ritual meant unity, but in truth, it meant submission, a surrender not only to each other, but to forces far older, darker, and hungrier than love. To bind love to loyalty, they bound flesh to fear. These weren't weddings, they were covenants, written in blood. The Vikings believed that the gods listened, that every drop of blood offered beneath moon and altar sealed their fate with divine favor. Yet, as generations passed, many who sought blessings found only ruin. The same oath sworn to bring fertility and fortune often gave birth to death and despair. Those who dared to bind themselves to the gods discovered too late that divine attention was a double-edged gift. The sagas are filled with warnings. They tell of kings who sought Odin's wisdom but received madness instead, of brides who prayed to Freya for children and bore none, of clans who sacrificed everything to the gods, only to see their line end in silence. It was said that when a marriage was sealed in deceit or greed, the gods marked the bloodline, and their vengeance unfolded slowly, like frost spreading through a field. In the House of Yngling, one of the oldest royal lines, misfortune became legend. The Yngling kings claimed descent from the gods themselves, Odin's own blood. Yet nearly every heir met a violent or mysterious death, drowned, burned, poisoned, or betrayed by kin. Chroniclers whispered that their divine marriages had angered the gods, that the sacrifices they once offered now demanded repayment. Their glory was proof not of favor, but of the gods' cruel amusement. Diseases struck suddenly and without mercy. Heirs were stillborn, brides went barren, and harvests failed beneath clear skies. To the Viking mind, these were not accidents. They were signs. The gods had turned away. leaving mortals to choke on the weight of their own promises. Blood once sacred had become tainted. The oaths sworn in love had curdled into curses. Even warriors began to fear wedding feasts, calling them tables of ghosts. They believed the ancestors, bound by ancient vows, haunted their descendants, feeding on their fear and pride. Some spoke of shadowed figures seen beside bridal beds, spirits of those sacrificed in the name of union, watching in silence as new vows were made. The past was never buried. It lingered, restless, demanding remembrance, and yet the kings continued. Their pursuit of eternal glory blinded them to the rot beneath their crowns. They raised temples, slaughtered beasts, and promised their children to the gods, hoping to reclaim favor. But each attempt only deepened the darkness. Their halls grew rich, but their blood grew thin. Their names echoed in sagas, but their legacies were soaked in sorrow. In the end, even the chroniclers began to wonder, were these curses the wrath of gods betrayed, or the revenge of ghosts created by their own hands? The line between divine punishment and human consequence blurred, and with it, the age of pagan power began to fade. As the first Christian missionaries reached the frost-bitten shores of Scandinavia, the old gods began to fall silent. The sound of the hammer of Thor faded beneath the chime of church bells, and with it, the ancient ways of union. The blood-soaked weddings of the North were driven underground. Pagan rites, once the heartbeat of royal power, were declared forbidden. The shamans who once anointed kings with blood were replaced by priests bearing holy water. The altar of sacrifice became the altar of salvation, but conversion was never clean. Beneath the hymns and prayers, the old pulse still throbbed. The Vikings who once poured blood for Odin now knelt before the cross, yet the fear of the gods they'd buried still haunted their minds. The ceremonies changed, candles instead of torches, scripture instead of runes, but the intent remained the same: to control destiny, to bind love to power, to sanctify dominion under a higher name. In these new Christian weddings, the priests spoke of purity, faith, and eternal love. Yet outside the church walls, whispers persisted. Some kings still held secret midnight gatherings, away from watchful eyes, where the old oaths were murmured beneath their breath. They would press their palms together, letting a drop of blood fall upon the earth, an echo of the forbidden vows once offered to the gods of war and harvest. To them, it wasn't heresy, it was heritage. They believed that to rule without the old gods' favor was to rule on borrowed time. The hypocrisy of this new age ran deep. The church condemned the brutality of pagan unions, yet it turned a blind eye to marriages arranged for power, alliances forged through deceit, and queens silenced beneath crowns. The rituals of control survived, only the symbols changed. The knife became a ring, the sacrifice became obedience. The violence, though hidden, still bled through the seams of sanctity. Still, there were those who could not let go of the old ways entirely. When plagues came and crops failed, kings once baptized in holy water sent secret offerings into the forest, food, silver, and sometimes blood, to appease the gods they claimed no longer existed. They knelt in chapels by day and whispered to Odin by night. For in the cold north, faith was never pure. It was layered, pagan fire burning beneath Christian frost. The gods were buried, but not forgotten. Their symbols carved into church beams, their stories woven into Christian psalms. And though the priests claimed victory, the land itself remembered. Even now, as cathedrals rise where temples once stood, the wind that howls across the fjords carries an older name, a name too ancient to die. And yet, their ghosts still whisper beneath frozen soil. The snow falls silently now over the lands that once burned with ritual fire. The chants have faded, the altars crumbled, the gods unnamed. Yet beneath the frost, the soil remembers, stained with vows spoken in blood and bound in fear. What began as sacred union became sacrifice, and what was meant to bless turned to curse. The Vikings believed their weddings called down the favor of gods, but perhaps what they summoned were only reflections of their own hunger, for power, for immortality, for control over the chaos of life. Every ritual, every kiss sealed with blood, was an attempt to tame the unknowable. Love in their world was never soft. It was a weapon, a duty, a chain, and in that chain lay both devotion and doom. The Norse kings who sought divine approval through pagan rites thought they could command eternity, yet eternity answered in frost and silence. Still, there is beauty in their brutality. In the flicker of torches against frozen skies, in the trembling hands of brides crowned in iron and ice, each ceremony was both a celebration and a warning. A reminder that love and power are never clean, and that to ask the gods for favor is to invite their wrath. As the centuries turned and the cross replaced the hammer, the frost crept deeper into their legacy. But even as Christian bells rang over the north, the echoes of those old oaths lingered, in lullabies, in sagas, in the hush of winter winds. For though the gods were silenced, the stories endured, whispering of a time when every vow could summon both blessing and curse. Were the Vikings monsters, or simply mirrors of us all? We too still chase divine approval, through rituals modern and unseen. We marry for status, we sacrifice for ambition, we bind ourselves in promises we barely understand. The forms have changed, but the shadows remain. Perhaps in the end, it was never about gods or curses, only about the human heart, forever reaching toward power and forever punished for it. In the pale light of the north, where ravens still circle the ruins of forgotten halls, the wind carries a sound like weeping, or perhaps laughter. The earth remembers, even when we choose to forget. Every vow carries a shadow, and in the Viking age that shadow bled.